Tides. Now, you may be wondering what tides are. Well, tides are the alternate rising and falling of the sea, usually twice in each lunar day at a particular place due to the attraction of the moon and sun. Now, that's a bit complicated of a definition, so let's break it down. There's two types of tides. There's high tide and there's low tide. High tide is when the average water level is higher, and low tide is when the water level is below average water level. Now, you may be wondering what causes the tides, because water just doesn't move up and down. Well, the answer is moon, and the moon's gravitational pull pulls water on the earth. Now, in this model, the bulges will represent the water. The further away the water is from the earth, the higher the water level is. So, if you see the bulge move out from the earth, the water level is higher and it's at high tide. So that will be point A, that's point B, and that's point C. Now, the moon pulls point A the most of all the points because the moon's gravitational pull forces the things closest to it more. Then it pulls point B, which is the solid earth, a little bit less than point A, and then it pulls C a tiny bit. Now that causes two high tides and two low tides to happen. Now when the moon revolves around the earth, the high tide and the low tide move with it. So the high tide is always on the front side, the side closest to the moon of the earth, and the back side. In this visual, you can see that the moon and the bulges move together. So when the moon moves around the earth, the bulges move with it. And you know that is caused because of the moon's gravity. Now, the tree represents a place on earth, and when it's covered up, that's when it's high tide, and when it's not covered, that's when it's low tide. Now you can see when the tree is at one point, it's not always at high tide when it's at that point. That's because once the tree moves around to that point again, the moon has moved a little bit, and that causes the tidal cycle. That means that you get a high tide every 12 hours and 25 minutes, and a low tide every 12 hours and 25 minutes in most locations on Earth. Now that means the difference in time between the high tide and the low tide is 6 hours and 12 and a half minutes. Now, that's why when a high tide never always happens on a certain time. In addition to the moon influencing the tides, the sun also influences the tides, but not as much as the moon. And the reason for this is the sun is so much further away from the earth than the moon is. The sun is almost 100 million miles away from Earth, and the moon is only 239,000 miles away. Now this is what the tides would look like if there was no sun influencing the tides, but when the sun influences the tides, this is what it looks like. So as you can see, the low tide got a little bit higher, and that's because the sun was influencing the tides there. So it's not a large influence, but the sun does influence the tides a bit. Now this brings us to our next point, which is tidal range. Now, tidal range is the difference between high tide and low tide. So if there's a large low tide and a small high tide, the tidal range is low. If there's a large high tide but a low tide, then the tidal range is high. Now, there's two types of tidal ranges. They're neap tide and spring tide. Now, spring tide. The first thing about spring tide is this has absolutely nothing to do with the season spring. Now, a spring tide is when the tidal range is the largest, which means the high tides are very high and the low tides are very low. You might also hear this as the tides are very extreme. Now, this happens when the moon is in either the phase new or full, so that means it also happens twice a month because the moon is at full and new once a month each, which is 2 times a month. Now, because of that, the moon could also be on the right side of the earth in this visual, but it happens both ways. Now, the second tidal range is neap tide. Now, this is the opposite of a spring tide, and this is when the tidal range is the smallest. So this is when the high tide isn't that high and the low tide isn't that low. And so this is when the tidal range is the smallest. And it happens when the moon is in the phase first or third quarter. And that means this type of tide also happens twice a month, because first quarter happens once a month, third happens once a month, and that's twice a month. And the moon could also be on the bottom of the earth in this visual. It happens both ways, just the same as the spring tide. Now an overview. So remember, the moon and the sun pull the ocean to create tides, and this creates a high and a low tide. And then when the moon revolves around the earth and the earth rotates, the high and low tide move to different places on earth. Now this creates tidal ranges, which is the difference between high and low tide. And the spring tide is when the tidal range is the largest, and neap is when the tidal range is the smallest. This has been an episode of Fun with Science.